Jen. Jen is currently a JavaScript developer for Catalyst in Wellington, but back in the day, like Django 1.1, she was a Django dev. So she has the perfect experience to be able to tell us about the happy coexistence that is Django and JavaScript. So if you're ready, Jen. Wonderful. Give Jen a big hand.
All right. Hello, everybody. I'm here to talk to you today about two things I love, JavaScript and Django. And for those of you that aren't getting the reference, that's the Django green and the JavaScript yellow, beautifully harmonizing there in the corner of my slide. So who am I? Well, Katie already covered this, but let's just hit those high points again. I'm the lead front-end developer at Catalyst in Wellington. Catalyst actually do have some Australian offices. We're in Melbourne and Sydney as well, but I'm come from over the ditch. I describe myself as a front-end developer, but I used to be full stack, and I started off in PHP and moved to Django development between 2009 and 2011, so it's pretty old school in terms of Django. It was still 1.0 and 1.1 was what I was learning on. And I still have a soft spot for it, and the Python community in general. And in my work as the front-end team lead at Catalyst, I still work on a lot of projects that are backed by Django. So although I'm not the Django developer, I'm working on a team that uses Django day to day. So, Django actually has a very long history with JavaScript. The first JavaScript commit into the Django core code base was 1,715 lines of vanilla JavaScript way back in July 2005 by Adrian Holovati, and that was adding some interactivity into the admin section, like live filtering of lists, you know, those sorts of things. Most of those original files are still there in the code base in one form or another today. So I just wanted to really highlight the fact that JavaScript has been there all along. And in terms of the interfaces we're building, our own custom code that we're building with Django, I'm pretty sure that a lot of you will have some form of JavaScript in your front ends as well. In fact, the recent Stack Overflow survey said that 62% of developers are using some form of JavaScript. And just to give you some context there, that's more than, say, they use SQL. And just for interest, Python is at 32%. So why do we want to add JavaScript to our Django websites? Well, it's a pretty straightforward reason. We want interactivity. We want no page loads. We want immediate form validation feedback and other ways of improving the UX, like modals for are you sure type confirmations or collapsible menus. There are some slightly more questionable uses as well. Hello, carousels, but what can you do? And in fact, we are more commonly building web apps, not websites nowadays. And as a general purpose framework, Django is well suited to this type of web application. And the way that in which we use JavaScript with Django has changed a lot over the years. And to be honest, this has been driven by the massive changes to JavaScript itself, both as a language and as an ecosystem. So I'm going to take some time now just to sort of provide a bit of context, and we're going to go back through the history of JavaScript. And we're not going to start from the very beginning of JavaScript in sort of 1995-ish, and the reasons why it has that name, JavaScript. Pro tip, it's pretty much because of marketing reasons in the first place. We're going to skip straight to 2005, when Django first came out. So by 2005, we had a standard-ish implementation of JavaScript across browsers, and that was the ECMAScript 3 standard. It's called the ECMAScript standard, not the JavaScript standard, because JavaScript is just a business name, a marketing name. The actual specification is ECMAScript, which is the European Computer Manufacturers Association. And actually, there are other implementations of ECMAScript as well. For example, Flash's ActionScript is one other variant. And as we come into 2005, we've got ECMAScript 3, and actually the committee has been working on ECMAScript 4 for quite a long time, quite a number of years at that point. But it really got locked into committee limbo for years and years, and it was ultimately abandoned in 2008 when the committee just couldn't agree on what the changes were going to be, because there were fairly far-reaching changes, introducing classes and some other fairly low-level things. So that left JavaScript stagnant and different browser implementations still with annoying fragmentation. So instead of version 4, in 2009, the Standards Committee launched the ECMAScript 3.1 standard, which, as 3.1 suggests, was just some extra little bits and pieces on top of 3. But just to keep the numbering consistent, they went for ECMAScript 5 as the name of that standard, and we just didn't get 4 at all. It took most browsers a couple of years to really get their implementations launched. So in that void, while this was all happening, we started to see the introduction of libraries. Most notably, in 2006, we got the launch of jQuery. And that really did a huge amount to save us from browser inconsistencies. And it also significantly improved ease of use for developers. There were a bunch of competing toolkits, things like Dojo EmojiKit and UI, but none of them ever reached the height of enduring popularity that jQuery did. So how do we use JavaScript with Django during this era? Well, I mean, I'm just hypothesizing here. This is a generalization. But I would say probably for most of us, we were probably using jQuery. Our JavaScript libraries probably sat in a folder called JS or JavaScript in our static files folder alongside our custom files. They were probably in the repository. This was before content security policy, so we might have even had inline script box in our Django templates folder. Or we were pulling in code from the static files folder. And we probably didn't have a code minification process for our JavaScript yet. So moving on for the next 5 years then, not much changed to the language itself after all of those shenanigans the previous 5 years. But we did see a lot of sort of an explosion of new template libraries and the very first JavaScript frameworks as well. For templating languages, we're talking about things like Mustache, Handlebars. There are lots of these. And they came about because writing HTML with jQuery is really a bit of a pain in the posterior, to be honest. And these templating languages, actually, I think quite a few of them were heavily inspired by the Django templating syntax, which is very clean and nice to write. So some of these see enduring use, but for most developers, they were kind of a stepping stone, an interim solution, with the full solution being to use a full JavaScript framework. And for this, I'm talking about things like Backbone, AngularJS, Ember.js, and Knockout.js. And again, there were loads more, but these are sort of the big 4 at the time. And these really came about because if you were writing quite a lot of JavaScript code in jQuery or vanilla JS, it was very, very easy to get yourself into a situation where you were writing lots of horrible spaghetti code. And we got early JS frameworks in response to that, and they brought in things like MVC patterns and other ways of encapsulating our code so that it followed patterns that other developers could then come back and maintain later. How did we use JS with Django then during this era? Well, we started to have to worry about the separation of our JavaScript templates because of syntax clashes into their own files. So we ended up with some templating in our templates folder and some in our static folder. We got a bunch of tooling introduced to Django itself to help manage these front-end processes. And we started to see the beginning of API-driven front ends using frameworks within, plugins within Django to make that possible. So the tooling that I'm talking about is things like Django Compressor and Django Pipeline. Can you stick up your hand if you've used one of these in your projects? Yeah, I thought so. There's a fair number of people in the room for who that's true. Now, both of these tie into Django via configuration that you write into your settings.py usually, and they provide things like preprocessing for CSS, minification and bundling of your JavaScript and CSS assets, as well as special template tags to use in your Django projects to reference those bundled files. Of the two, Compressor is slightly less invasive to a normal front-end process, but you still need to make sure that you are running things like offline compression, or there can be quite a performance hit there. And to be honest, it's also a little bit magical. If you've got a front-end developer coming into one of these projects who hasn't been familiar with Django previously, I can speak through experience of mentoring junior colleagues that it is just take them a little while to understand quite what's happening. How is my less magically being transformed? I didn't do anything. The other drawback is that you can only support processing steps that are directly supported by these two plugins. And there's a whole world of front-end plugins for build processes that suddenly becomes unavailable if you're tied into one of these two. API-driven front ends. So I've actually left one off this slide, which is Piston, because it stopped being updated in about 2013. But that was one of the early ones. And then we got TastyPy and the Django REST framework. Now, my teams have worked with both of these, and you can produce a very solid, RESTful CRUD API with both of these. But I would say nowadays, for ease of use, you definitely want to look at the Django REST framework specifically, because it's pretty fantastic. Easy to use, and it even gives you kind of an admin interface for development as well. And these RESTful endpoints really give your front ends the ability to request data from the back end as and when it's required. So it's giving more power to those front ends. Right, nearly done. Coming up to date. Now, in the last couple of years, we've really seen massive changes within the JavaScript world. From 2015, we do start seeing changes to the language specification again. We got ECMAScript. Well, it should have been originally 6, but they decided to call it officially 2015. But most people refer to it as ES6. Now, the thing about this is that, unfortunately, you know, I mentioned when ECMAScript 5 came out, it took browsers a couple of years to actually implement those changes and for us to be able to use those language features. We had this same problem with the new specification. We had all of this cool stuff being promised and no way of actually using it yet. And speaking as a front-end developer, this is kind of a common thing, but it's really frustrating to hear about something cool and go, oh, I can't actually use that for another 3 years yet. Fortunately, there were some very impatient, brilliant people in the community who introduced us to this idea of transpilation, which is just compilation, really, but it's specifically from one language target to another language target. And that's taking it means we get to write ES6 code now, and then it transpiles it back to ES5, which runs in current browsers. Imagine if you could have just started writing Python 3 when it originally became available, rather than waiting for every library that you depended on to support it. Wouldn't have that been game-changing? We got new frameworks. Angular made a bit of a mistake. They had a popularity stumble after they prematurely announced that the next version would be drastically different. And that was Angular 2, and more recently they've retconned history, and Angular 2 is now called Angular, and Angular 1 is now called AngularJS, just to get that straight for everybody, no misunderstanding there. React is not a full framework in itself, but it's super popular, and it's teamed up with state management tools like Redux that can do a really good job, and you can write cool stuff really quickly. And Vue is somewhere in between the two and something of a recent up-and-comer. And again, there are tons more things out there, but these are sort of the popular three at the minute. Beyond just that, though, we now have package management tools. So Bower used to be specifically for client-side dependencies, but most people are just using NPM now, because if you can get away with using just one tool in place of two, why wouldn't you? NPM gets a lot of flack, but personally, I've spent way more time swearing at pip than I ever have at NPM. It's easy to use. There are well thought out manifest files. Sure, it's definitely got problems, but most of those problems are actively being worked on. We recently saw the introduction of lock files and a lot of performance increases as well. Yarn works on top of the NPM catalog, offers a few interface and performance buffs, but I would say mostly the latest NPM has caught up now, and if you were just getting started with front-end dependency management, then definitely NPM is probably the thing to use. Many new build tools specifically for front-end processes, and you do seem to get a new one of these every 6 months or so. But for the last while, Webpack has been dominant. I expect this to remain a fast-moving space, but despite the complexity of getting some of these set up, they can provide really good experiences once they're up and running. So, we also see static types if you want to use them. That's still very much an optional thing. I see some projects using these and some not. And we also start to see a bunch of influences from functional programming coming into JavaScript. So I've been talking about all of this cool new stuff, but can you stick your hand up for me if you've used any ES6? Okay, so we do have about half of the people in the room who have actually written some. That's really neat. But just for those of you that haven't, we're just going to do a few minutes of whistle-stop tour of some of those new features, because it's no use us putting this extra effort into all of this transpilation process unless it's giving us something good. So we'll just whip through these quickly now. So let and const instead of var. In JavaScript, you used to have to define variables with var, which is the last one there. And if you are naughty and declare that outside a function, it's got global scope, which is there. That's a technical term, by the way. Now we have let and const, and they have block scope instead of function scope that var used to have. And a block is the same as, well, in Python it would be an indented block. In JavaScript it's usually within curly braces. And in the case of const, it cannot be reassigned. There is a little bit of a gotcha here. It is not immutable, it just can't be reassigned. So if you give it an object, you could actually add new keys and properties to that object. But still, this gives us the ability to describe things as we intend them to be used. We have string interpolation, finally. So we can declare ourselves a variable here, and we can put that into our string with the $curly brace syntax, which is a wee bit ugly, but does the job. And we can also have multi-line strings. This is heaven now. And we can have things like double quotes and single quotes without needing to escape them. Simple stuff, but it really does make a difference in your everyday day-to-day programming. We've got arrow functions instead of normal functions. Well, actually not instead of, as well as. They have some deep syntacticalness that I won't quite cover here, but this is what the syntax looks like. You can pass in multiple arguments, and then we use the equal sign and the angle bracket to say, and here's the function that acts on these parameters. You can get really terse if you want to. This bottom one here is a one-liner where because we're returning something, we're omitting the return and we're omitting the curly braces, and because we've just got one parameter, we're omitting the normal braces too. I'm personally not really a big fan of that, but if you like terseness, you've got options now. We've got proper module imports, and these are going to look very familiar to Python developers in the room. I mean, the syntax is ever so slightly different, star instead of dot, but we can do things like wildcard imports, specific named imports, and this is really cool, and it works. We have classes, finally. Unlike the classes that we're going to be introduced with ECMAScript 4, they're basically just syntactic sugar. But yeah, we've got classes. You can extend them. There are getters and setters for them. We've got methods on the classes. Did I mention inheritance? Oh, and I've also snuck one other thing into this slide here. We've got default values for undefined variables that you're passing in as well, which is great. There's a ton of new stuff. But actually, if you were to read through the whole list, like if you were like, oh, this ES6 thing, I'm not real sure about it, how do I learn about it? I really recommend this cheat sheet that I've put a little shortener link into at the bottom there, called ES6 cheat sheet. And you can read through that in about half an hour, and it will tell you everything you need to know. Right, so that's what modern JavaScript is. But how do we use it? More specifically, how do we use it with Django now? Oh, and actually, an aside. Regarding JavaScript fatigue, I read more and more about JavaScript being off-putting because of the constant pace of change. And how can we possibly keep up with this? And I would just like to say, you don't need to try out every new thing, especially for your work projects or projects with deadlines. But you also can't totally cover your ears with your hands and sing la la la. Modern JavaScript has a reputation for being complicated. It is, but for good reasons. We can build better things with it. That initial complication fuels a really great developer experience. When I've got my Webpack running with my React hot reload and I make a change in my code and my web browser refreshes automatically with all the state still maintained, that speeds up my development. It's great. A lot of the current complexity comes from getting rid of that multi-year cycle of waiting for browsers to release new features. And I'm personally really happy to be free of that impatient wait. The community is producing a lot of tooling to make initial barriers of entry lower. For example, in the React community, there is a project called Create React App. It's officially maintained. And what this does is, when you're getting started with React, they recently switched all of their tutorial documentation and everything over to using ES6. And they realized there was a barrier of entry to new members of the community because you can't have a tutorial where you have to say, well, first you need to install these things and do this thing and do this thing and do this thing, and now you can get on with the tutorial. So Create React App takes all of that complexity away from those users. It builds the Webpack configuration for you, and it hides it all away so you don't need to worry about it. But more importantly, it makes it so you can get that configuration back when you're ready to start tweaking it yourself. There's an eject feature. That means you can take that control as and when you outgrow the training wheels of Create React App. And it's well documented too, which is super important. So we could be using something like that. We also have a new tool for Django. I only recently found out about this. This is Django Webpack Loader. And it's a lot less invasive than Compressor or Pipeline in that you have your normal front-end build process. And this plugin just provides you that link back to your Django templates through template tags. So that you can inject those files into your template files. And whenever something new comes up for Webpack, we can immediately put that into our front-end build pipeline. We don't need to wait if Django Webpack Loader supports it because we're starting to decouple our front-end and our back-end dependencies. And that's really good. We can go further than that, though. We can totally decouple our front-end and our back-end. We can have totally separate repositories. Sorry, I hate this acronym. We can have a SPA front end. That's single page application for those of you that haven't heard that before. We can have a Django REST framework backend. We can have maybe some automated provisioning to help us tie those two repositories back together for a development environment. And we basically just use a web server like Apache or Nginx to proxy those two things together so that we can have a seamless one domain with a front end and back end on it working together. So I want to talk about this a little bit more. And to do so, I'm going to show you a bit of a demo. So I mentioned I work at Catalyst in Wellington, and one of the projects that I've been working on recently is Smart Start, which is a tool provided by DIA, which is in New Zealand, that's the Department of Internal Affairs, so a government agency. And it's a way of pulling together all of the information about what services are available to you as a potential parent. Okay, so it's about what services are available to me as I'm considering having a child. So let's pull that up now. Just give me a wee second to swap this over to the correct monitor. All right, so this is Smart Start. And it's, here we go, there's my cursor, fantastic. As I say, it's information, and it provides sort of a timeline of services here. So you can see pregnancy weeks 0 to 14, all of this stuff. You probably don't care about that, so let's talk about the technology. Right. So this is very API driven. It's got a Django REST framework backend and providing data for when we want to save things to our to-do list here. So we can check something off and have that be saved persisted into our Django models. We've got authentication being provided by Django, actually in this case via an IDP, which is the RealMe is sort of a government authentication and ID service provided by the New Zealand government. And we have a front end that is built with React. So I'm just going to skip right down to the bottom of the page here. Quite a lot of information on this site. These links at the bottom, if I go to the privacy page, you can, if you watch the URL bar, you'll see that we change to a different URL, so you can bookmark this and have it behave normally. But we didn't have a page load there. This was all happening as part of the single page application. And that is going to work great for applications as well, where you have more complex interactions happening than you do on this website. So how is that set up? Well, it's all pretty straightforward. I'm just going to pull up some code for you. Just find my cursor again. OK. Ooh, resolution, fun. Right, so our front-end process is pretty common in the front-end world. We've got a source folder that contains all of our uncompiled, untranspiled assets. And we've got a dist folder where our build process puts all of those files. And that has, you can see here, its own templating for the initial HTML page, which means that once that gets written, we're writing in the link to the JavaScript dynamically with a cache-busting URL. Webpack takes care of all of that for us. And then to serve that, we just have Nginx. Probably I could just pop over here. Here we go. We have an Nginx configuration for our front-end content, saying that we serve that index.html file at the root of our domain. And to make sure that we have our back-end stuff, we namespace this API URL, and that does a proxy to our Django backend, which is running on a separate port. Okay? So that works together really nicely. This is just one way of doing the configuration. There are a bunch of different ways. And in terms of what we're doing on the back end, I mentioned that, actually, I'll just take a step back for a second. We've got our application split up into different apps here. That just means that we can pull those out if we want to refactor this slightly later. And one of the APIs is, like I said, Django REST Framework is really easy. One of our APIs is as simple as that for a read-only API. The ones that where you have to be able to write to them might get a little bit more interesting. But Django REST Framework does make this stuff really easy. One last thing I'll mention about this demo. There's a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about single-page web applications in terms of their indexing for search engine optimization purposes. I was worried about that coming into this project. I hadn't done a SPA in a while, and historically, some of the search engines had done a really bad job with indexing JavaScript pages. And I was looking at a service called prerender.io as a way of pre-rendering the pages and serving those up to the crawler for search engine optimization purposes. But actually, it was indexed no problem at all. And more than that, you can see that separate single-page application routes are also being indexed by Google. I can't speak to the other search engines, but really, do we care? And the one gotcha I will mention is that if you care about having separate Facebook meta tags for different pages of your site, you can't do that with a single page application if you've just got one index.html, because the Facebook crawler doesn't render JavaScript, which is a little bit ironic, seeing this is a React site, which is maintained by Facebook, but there you go. Hopefully they'll make their crawler better in future. Okay, so I've talked about the fact that there are lots of different ways of doing this. And I want to focus in a bit on how do you pick the right JavaScript library, framework, or pattern, given that there are so many and it's so fast changing. Well, unfortunately, I have to say there isn't a correct answer here. It's really a sort of a how long is a piece of string kind of a thing. But you can, as developers, ask yourself these questions. Are you building a website or are you building a web app? If you're building a website, maybe it's okay that you use Django templates and then embed JavaScript widgets into those pages as you need them. It's faster in some use cases. If you're building a web app, there is a much stronger case to be made for building a single-page application and decoupling your front end entirely. But again, it does depend a wee bit. Is your JavaScript for decorative or functional purposes? I don't mean functional as in functional programming. I mean as in, does it do business stuff? Is it important? If you're building a website and the JS is just for cosmetic stuff, like maybe putting some bits of text in a modal or adding an accordion or anything like that, maybe you don't need a full JavaScript framework, and just a simple library like Bootstrap's JavaScript, or even just good old jQuery is going to do the job. Do you need a full MVC framework for your JavaScript? Do you need batteries and a kitchen sink and everything included? If you're working on a really large project and you've got some front-end time to invest, then choosing one of these can, over time, save your team a lot of time and give you a lot of functionality out of the box. The downside is that you are going to need to respect their opinions to get the most from them. And I'm talking about things like Angular or Ember here, full MVC frameworks. This one's pretty straightforward. If there is business logic in your JavaScript code, full stop, you need unit tests for your JavaScript. Fortunately, there is a good ecosystem for that now. Jest is my current favorite, but there are tons of them out there, and you can pick the tooling that best suits your team. So, there is one other development, one elephant in the room in the JavaScript community that we haven't touched on at all yet. And that's the competition. Node.js, right? Are there any Django killer Node.js apps? Well, fortunately, you can probably breathe a sigh of relief, because I have to say right now, probably not really. There are some good contenders, though. I would say these are the three of the most popular right now. We've got Sales.js, Meteor, Keystone. So Sales is probably the closest to Django, and then it's just a server-side MVC. framework. Meteor and Keystone are taking advantage of the fact that they are JavaScript to be full stack frameworks, both client-side and server-side, with one framework. But I said not really. Why did I mean that? Well, there is a lot of fragmentation here. These are smaller communities, and the projects, just for dint of time at least now, are not as mature. So why would we consider picking a Node.js framework for our project? Because a lot of people do. There are people out there picking them. Well, foremost, it's really tempting to be able to write just one language. I could see how if you had a new team and you were getting them up to speed, just saying, okay, you've got this one thing to learn, could be a real big advantage. They also have first-class support for asynchronous stuff. There's the possibility of doing isomorphic render. If you haven't heard that term before, what it means is that if you've got client-side JavaScript pages, you would render those initially on the server as a speed saving and serve those up. And then everything works seamlessly after that as updates happen. There's also WebSockets, and this idea of making our back-end services more modular into microservices. Some of these JavaScript frameworks are quite well suited to that. Django fights back. Well, we can't compete on the one language thing. We just can't. But we have excellent documentation. Like, I seriously have all of the hearts for Django's documentation. It's my #1 feature of the framework. There's a great community, and you just can't beat the maturity of the projects and the stability and the leadership. Some of those other features then. Django with isomorphic render. Well, you can either stick with your decoupled front end and use a JavaScript service like Next.js. There's one for Vue as well. I forget the name exactly. Or you could look at this new library. I haven't used this personally. I only recently found out about it, called Python React. And that is going to help. You still have to have a Node.js server on your backend, but it's going to help tie that isomorphic render back into your Django infrastructure. WebSockets, channels was originally supposed to be launched as an official, go into core Django. That hasn't quite happened, but it is an officially maintained part of Django now. Gives you that WebSockets functionality and a ton more besides. And I'm really interested to find out more about it. It looks really exciting. If you're interested in that concept of microservices, we think of lightweight and lean when we think of microservices, but I don't think that automatically rules Django out. There's a talk by Paul Hallett that was given at DjangoConAU last year, I believe. There's a link to it there that talks about how they are using Django as microservices at their company. Right. Where do we go from here? We've talked about what is and what was. What about moving forwards? Browser and JavaScript functionality is going to keep on changing. There is new functionality all of the time. Progressive web apps are the next big thing. There are notification APIs to give push notifications to our phone. We can do video and data transfer now. There's also a talk later today that I'm really looking forward to, which is the offline Django with service workers talk. So I'm looking forward to that later on. I think as all of these changes happen, though, Django and JavaScript continue to be good friends. It's still an excellent partner in crime for today's modern web apps and websites. I'm still very happy to use it, and I'm still very happy to be tangentially part of this community. Thank you very much.